The morning my brother got promoted to senior partner, my mother called me before she called anyone else, not to share the news, to ask if I could pick up the centerpiece flowers for the celebration dinner because the florist was closer to my side of town. That was the whole call. 43 seconds. I know because I was still holding my phone when the screen showed the duration. I am a licensed social worker. I has been one for 6 years. I carry a caseload of 22 families at any given time, mostly single mothers navigating the child welfare system, teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go, elderly men who haven't had a real conversation with another person in weeks. I make $54,000 a year. I drive a 2017 Honda Civic with a crack in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident I never got fixed because there were other things to pay for. My apartment is a one-bedroom in a zip code my mother once described, without apparent irony, as up-and-coming. My brother is a real estate attorney. He may partner at 31. My parents have a framed photo of him at his firm's anniversary gala on the mantle in the living room, right next to my sister's MBA graduation portrait. The two of them, side by side in that gilded frame, looking like exactly what my parents spent 30 years trying to produce. I'm not in that frame. I was never asked to be. I want to be careful here because this is not a story about being the overlooked child. Every family has one, and I don't think mine is special in that way. What I want to tell you about is a single evening. A dinner at a restaurant my parents could not actually afford but booked anyway because the address sounded right. And what happened when the man I had been seeing for almost 2 years sat down at that table, and my father opened his mouth. His name is Wells. Wells Harmon. He grew up in eastern Tennessee, went to state school on a partial scholarship, and for the last decade has been running a nonprofit that provides transitional housing and job training for formerly incarcerated men. The organization operates across 4 counties. Last year, they placed over 300 people into stable employment. He has a staff of 11 and a budget that requires him to write grants the way some people write grocery lists, constantly and without guarantee. He drives a truck that is older than our relationship and keeps a worn copy of a James Baldwin essay collection on his passenger seat. When I first told my mother about him, her exact response was, "And I am not reconstructing this for effect," she said, "a nonprofit. That's very admirable." And then she moved on to asking whether I'd seen my brother's new condo. That was 8 months before the dinner. I met Wells at a community resource fair I was staffing with 2 colleagues. He was at the table next to ours, talking to a man just out of a county facility about what the next 60 days could look like if he had somewhere safe to land. I watched him for a few minutes before I realized I was watching him. He wasn't performing compassion. He was just present in a way that some people never learn to be. We talked for 20 minutes after the fair ended. He asked what drew me to social work, not how I found it or how long I'd been doing it. What drew me? I told him about the summer after my junior year of college when I volunteered at a family shelter and met a 7-year-old boy who carried everything he owned in a backpack with a broken zipper held shut with a twist tie. How that image had lived in me for years before I understood what to do with it. Wells listened without once glancing at his phone. He was not, I would learn, a simple person. There were small things I noticed and filed away without quite examining them. A phone call he took outside a restaurant that lasted 40 minutes, his voice low and even, the cadence of someone managing something serious. A draft document left open on his laptop once when I walked past, dense with legal language. Something about a land acquisition and a memorandum of understanding. A name dropped casually in conversation, a state senator referred to by first name, someone Wells described only as a person I've worked with on some policy stuff. I asked about it once. He said it was background noise, meetings and letters that came with trying to keep a nonprofit funded in a political environment. I believed him. And also, none of it changed the fact that he was the only person I had ever dated who, when I told him about a client, listened like the story mattered. My brother's promotion dinner was held at a restaurant called Ledger House, the kind of place that puts the price of the wine list before the name of the wine. Private dining room, 12 guests. My parents at the heads of the table. My brother sat at the center with his wife and their two children arranged around him like a portrait. I was seated at the far end, between my brother's college roommate and an empty chair that eventually held my cousin, who arrived late and spent most of the meal on his phone. Wells and I were not seated together. My mother had arranged it that way. She told me it would help the conversation flow better, mixing people up. Wells ended up at the other end of the table, next to my father, who shook his hand with the specific enthusiasm of someone making a point of being generous. My father gave a toast about 40 minutes in. He is good at toasts, I'll give him that. He knows how to fill a room with the impression of warmth. He talked about my brother's work ethic, about watching him argue moot court cases in the living room as a teenager, about what it meant to see your child become someone who built something lasting. The table was fully attentive. My brother's wife had tears in her eyes. Then my father looked down the table toward me. It was deliberate, that look, the kind with a half-second of preparation behind it. And my daughter, he said, is doing her thing in social services. We're proud of her in her own way. He smiled at Wells then, the way you smile at someone you've already decided is temporary. And her partner is doing work in the nonprofit space, which is, as they say, meaningful. He let the last word sit there. Meaningful. The way you'd use it to describe a child's macaroni art. Several people nodded. Someone changed the subject. Wells set down his fork very slowly. My brother's former law school professor was at the dinner. His name was Desmond Crawford, and I had met him exactly once before, briefly at a holiday party the previous year. He was a quiet, precise man who had taught constitutional law for 20 years before moving into a senior role at a policy institute that worked on criminal justice reform. He had been seated near my father, near the head of the table, the gravity of the evening naturally pulling its most credentialed guests to the center. He had been watching Wells for the last 20 minutes with an expression I couldn't read from where I was sitting. When my father finished his toast, Professor Crawford leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular, and then directly to Wells. "I've been trying to place you all evening. You're Wells Harmon, from the Harmon Reentry Initiative." Wells said yes, that was him. Professor Crawford set down his own fork. He looked at my father with the careful expression of someone who is about to correct a mistake and is being kind about it. "Warren, do you know who this man is?" My father made the sound of someone who assumed the answer would be manageable. Wells Harmon's organization was cited in the state's Criminal Justice Reform Commission report last spring, Professor Crawford said. The transitional housing model they built in Claiborne County has become something of a template. 3 other states have sent teams to study it. He paused. His reentry completion rate is the highest in the region by a significant margin. Last year, he was invited to present findings to a Senate subcommittee on workforce reintegration. He looked at my father the way a professor looks at a student who has said something confidently wrong. He's also, from what I understand, the reason the Millbrook Youth Shelter kept its federal funding last year. His organization underwrote the gap when the grant fell through. My father opened his mouth. He closed it. "I work with people who have nowhere else to go," Wells said. His voice was even, not raised, not performing. "I don't need a title for that to be worth doing." He looked at my father without any particular anger. "But I want to say something, and I hope it lands the way I mean it." He looked at me then. "She carries 22 families at a time," he said. "People in the worst moments of their lives, and she shows up every day with enough steadiness that they believe things can be different. I have watched her take a call at 10 at night from a teenager in crisis and talk that kid back from the edge without once making him feel like a burden. What she does is not small. And the fact that this family has spent years making her feel like a footnote in her own story is something she has been too patient about for too long." He looked back at my father. "Meaningful is the word people use when they haven't bothered to understand something." The table was very quiet. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her plate. I had spent years inside this particular silence. The silence after something true had been said in a room where truth was considered impolite. I knew how to arrange my face into something neutral and wait for the conversation to move on. I had done it at holidays, at Sunday dinners, at every performance review of my life that my father had received as a courtesy copy without asking. I didn't do that this time. I said, "You've been framing it as pride this whole evening. Proud of her in her own way, her thing, her path. As if the modifier is the kindness and not the diminishment. I don't need a different kind of pride. I just needed you to look." My mother said my name. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to know that because I think you're waiting for anger so you can dismiss it. I'm just done translating myself into something you'll accept." I picked up my bag. I looked at Wells. We left. The drive home was quiet for a while. Not uncomfortable. Wells had the radio on low, some station playing older country music, and we didn't say much until we were past the highway interchange and into the slower roads. He said, "You okay?" I thought about the honest answer to that question, which was not simple. "I think so," I said. "I think I just needed to hear myself say it out loud." He nodded. He didn't tell me I was brave or that I'd done the right thing. He just drove, and I watched the streetlights pass, and somewhere in that stretch of ordinary road I felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. Like a low-grade pressure I had learned to call normal had simply stopped. My brother called the next morning. His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard before. He said Professor Crawford had pulled him aside after we left, that the professor had mentioned he was involved in a state bar committee that was reviewing several firms, including my brother's, for appointment to a public interest advisory panel, that he'd said, without saying anything directly, that character was visible in a lot of ways, and that the evening had been informative. My brother said he wasn't blaming me. I noticed he didn't say he was sorry. My sister called 2 days later. She had heard from our mother, who had apparently spent the intervening days composing her version of events. According to my sister, the official family narrative was that I had made a scene and embarrassed everyone. I asked my sister what she thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I've been letting them set the terms for a long time, for all of us, including for how I see you." That surprised me. My sister and I had never been close in the way that people mean when they say sisters are best friends. We were civil, fond at a distance, careful with each other. What she said cost her something. I could tell by how she said it. My mother called 4 days after the dinner, not to apologize, to ask if I was all right, which in my family's language is the beginning of an apology, if you know how to read it. I told her I was. She said, "Your father and I have been talking." I waited. She said, "I don't think we understood what we were doing. I want to understand. I'm not sure I know how, but I want to try." My mother is not a person who admits uncertainty. It is not in her vocabulary as she has built it. Hearing her say, "I'm not sure I know how," was like watching someone use a word in a language they'd always claimed not to speak. I told her what it would take. Not a list of grievances, not a performance of forgiveness. A family therapist, 4 sessions minimum, one of which would be just the 3 of us with me speaking without being redirected. She agreed. She didn't negotiate the number of sessions, which told me she had already been thinking about it before she called. The first session was the hardest thing I have done in a professional life built around hard things. My father sat with his hands folded on his knees and listened in the way people listen when they are trying not to react rather than trying to understand. But he listened. By the 3rd session, he had started to respond to things I said instead of waiting for me to finish so he could explain. That is not nothing. In my work, I have learned to recognize the difference between the motion of progress and the thing itself. And what I saw in my father by the 3rd session was a man beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to hear something he had been drowning out for years. My brother and I had coffee last month. He brought it up first, the dinner, Professor Crawford, what he'd said. He told me he'd thought about it more than he expected to. He said, "I think I took advantage of the arrangement." The way things were set up between you and me and mom and dad. It was easier for me, and I didn't look at what that cost you. I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't, and he knew it wasn't, and I think the most honest thing I could give him was not disagreeing. I said, I know you see it now. That matters. He nodded. We drank our coffee. We talked about other things, and the conversation had a different texture than it used to, less performed, more room in it. Wells and I had dinner at his apartment last week. Nothing special. Pasta and a bottle of wine that cost $11, which is our preferred price point. I told him about the coffee with my brother. He listened the way he always listens. After a while, I said, You didn't have to say what you said at the dinner. He said, I know. I said, It wasn't your moment to fix. He said, I wasn't your moment to fix. He said, I wasn't trying to fix it. I just wanted them to see you the way I see you. Before you got up to leave anyway. That is the thing about Wells. He has never once tried to rescue me. He just refuses to pretend that the room is arranged fairly when it isn't. There's a difference between those two things, and it took me a long time to understand it. I think about my clients sometimes when I think about that dinner. The ones who come into my office having spent years making themselves smaller to survive systems that weren't built for them. The work of that, how much energy it takes to compress yourself into a shape someone else decided was acceptable. I did a version of that for a long time inside my own family. Not consciously. It becomes automatic, the adjustment, until you forget there was ever a different option. I'm not pretending everything is resolved. My parents and I are still in the careful, deliberate work of learning a different way of being in the same room. Some weeks it moves. Some weeks we just sit across from each other and endure it. My brother is trying, in his way. My sister has started calling me more, which is new, and I don't want to make too much of it or too little. What I know is this. The night I drove home from that dinner with the radio on low and Wells beside me, something shifted that I cannot put back. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet way that permanent things usually happen. I walked into my apartment, and I stood in my kitchen for a minute, and I thought about the boy with the broken zippered backpack, and the families I would see on Monday, and the teenager I had talked back from a ledge, and all the ordinary invisible work that fills my days. And I thought, this is not a detour. This is the whole road. I have stopped waiting for someone in my family to hand me that recognition. I already knew it. I just needed to stop apologizing for knowing it. So I'll ask you something before I go. Is there something you do or something you are that you've been letting someone else shrink with their silence? Something you've been translating into smaller words to make it easier for people who haven't bothered to understand it? You don't have to keep doing that. I thought a lot about what my father said that night. Not the words exactly, meaningful, her thing in her own way, but the structure underneath them. The way a person can arrange language to sound like praise while doing the work of dismissal. It takes a kind of practiced intelligence to pull that off, and for a long time I mistook it for love. What happened at that dinner was not a dramatic reversal. No one was punished in any clean or satisfying way. What happened was simpler and, I think, more honest than that. My father said something careless in front of someone who knew better, and that person said so, and then I said so, and the accumulation of those two things in that order, in that room, cracked something open that had been sealed for years. That's how it usually works, not in explosions. In small, precise moments where the truth gets said out loud and there's no way to unhear it. Wells never asked for credit for what he did. He didn't bring it up afterward as evidence of anything. He just said what was true about me, plainly, in a room full of people who had chosen not to see it, and then he sat back down. That kind of steadiness is not common. It comes from people who have spent years doing work that doesn't photograph well, work that requires you to believe in its value before anyone else confirms it. He learned that the way I learned it, not from praise, but from showing up anyway when the praise wasn't coming. And Desmond Crawford, my brother's professor, a man who had no stake in any of this, who owed me nothing. He chose honesty over comfort. That's a choice. Not everyone makes it. The people in that room who nodded along when my father spoke, who changed the subject after, who let the silence smooth everything over. They made a different choice. I don't resent them for it, but I notice it. I notice it the way I notice it in my clients, the bystanders who watch a situation clearly and decide that keeping the peace is the same as doing right. It isn't. It never is. My father's consequence was not losing a client or a dinner or a professional relationship, though some of those things shifted in the weeks after. His real consequence was simpler. He had to sit in a room with a therapist and listen to his daughter describe what the last 6 years had felt like. That's harder than losing a contract. I watched him do it. I watched him resist it and then, slowly, begin to actually hear it. That's the thing about real accountability. It doesn't feel like losing. It feels like a door you've been pushing against finally opening an inch and realizing you're the one who had been holding it shut. I don't have a clean lesson to offer. I have only what I know from working with people in the middle of the hardest passages of their lives. The people who make it through are not the ones who were treated well. They're the ones who kept showing up, who refused to let someone else's blindness become their definition, who eventually found at least one person willing to see them clearly and held on to that like a lifeline. Wells was that for me. I hope you have someone like that. And if you don't yet, I hope you're willing to be that for yourself first.